an extraordinary event. We have been taking advantage of the fact that we're virtual, and so we have a collection of speakers whom we would have a very difficult time assembling all in one room to share their thoughts with you. But because we're on Zoom and communicating with you digitally and virtually, we have a chance to hear from really an extraordinary group of scholars who have a deep interest in both policy practice and managerial practice. And I'm also excited to share with you the fact that this is one of our first events organized at Harvard with a range of pieces and units at Harvard. And so this event is co-sponsored by the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, the China Health Partnership, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So we are practicing at Harvard our cross-boundary collaboration in anticipation of a wide range of events like this in which we can try to do things that Harvard has not traditionally been good at doing. My name is Rawi Abdullah. I'm the faculty director at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a professor at Harvard Business School. I have myself been giving a lot of thought to questions about how the pandemic and an era of quarantine have influenced the global economy. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you several scholars who are thinking a great deal about the implications of pandemic and quarantine for particular national economies, for the global economy. And I'm going to introduce them to you one by one, and then ask each of them to share some remarks for 5 to 7 minutes. Several of them have presentations that they'll be sharing with you. I invite you, as you are listening in, to chat in your questions so that we can assemble them and share them with our colleagues and ask them to reflect on some of these broader issues that are on our minds. So first, we will have Monica DeBoll speak. She's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and director for Latin American Studies and Emerging Markets at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. We also have with us Raj Chowdhury, who is the Lumry Family Associate Professor at Harvard Business School and has been working on questions of the future of work and the emergent geography of work. He's an expert in questions of remote work. And since we have, all of us, I assume, spent quite a bit of time on Zoom and trying to imagine what might come next in our remote connections to our workplaces, Raj will be able to share some thoughts about that. We have next Willy Shih, who is the Robert and Jane Cizik Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School and is an expert in both manufacturing competitiveness and global supply chains. Insofar as one of the key stories of this era of pandemic and quarantine was a major disruption in global supply chains as China essentially went offline for a number of weeks. Trying to imagine what global supply chains might look like next is an important task for thinking about how the economy functions, but also how firms and we as citizens and consumers engage with the effects of the transformation of these global supply chains. Willy is, without a doubt, the best person in the world to reflect on these questions. And we also have joining us Natalia Volchkova, who is director of the Center of Economic and Financial Research at the New Economic School in Moscow, as well as a senior lecturer, also an expert in questions of macroeconomics and political economy and globalization. So we will go in that order. And so I would like please to ask Monica to begin sharing her thoughts. And we will remind ourselves to stay muted, and I will invite again all of you to chat in your questions as they occur to you, and we will collect them and pose them to our dear colleagues. So Monica, please start us off.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rawi. Thank you to Harvard. Thank you to all my distinguished colleagues here on this webinar. It's a true pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about COVID, Latin America, and the challenges that the region is facing. I mean, obviously the regions are the challenges are many. Latin America is a region that's been facing a lot, that was already facing a lot of challenges even before the pandemic hit the world. And of course, a lot of those challenges have been exacerbated by COVID. The region did have a little bit of time to prepare, seeing what was already happening around the world. But of course, the politics, the institutional makeup, the context of Latin America is not one that is, let's say, very favorable to preparation in a sense. And so what we've seen in many countries is, the pandemic hitting and then countries just basically having to react. So there wasn't really any preparation, even though the warning signs were all out there. Responses across the region have been varied. So there have been countries that have had greater success in sort of stemming or trying to control the epidemic. But at the same time, there are also countries that face extreme economic challenges because they were already facing these challenges before. So countries like Ecuador and Argentina, Ecuador being being a dollarized economy, being formally dollarized, and Argentina being partially dollarized, and therefore having a lot of issues. It's a country that's in default as we speak. All of these problems preceded the epidemic, but of course, the economics of getting out of the economic crisis aspect of the epidemic has now been much enhanced and multiplied by the fact that there's a public health crisis, and there was already a preceding situation that was extremely serious before. Other countries like Chile and others in the region have been able to have some response and are doing whatever they can under the circumstances. But there's one sort of big elephant in the room, which is actually the country that I come from, Brazil, which is posing a lot of issues, not just to itself, but to the region as a whole, given that is the largest country in the region. Brazil has followed a policy of hands off, we should say, because it has literally not done anything. Some governors in Brazil did try to follow the types of sanitary measures that were being followed elsewhere in the world, but the president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been a denier of the seriousness of the epidemic, and has been in a tug of war with these governors and state and local authorities over the past 3 months. The bottom line is that there's never really been any type of sanitary restriction in Brazil, and now the country is quote unquote reopening. It is also the country that is currently second in the world, second only to the US in terms of number of cases, total cases, number of deaths, and the epidemiological curve looks absolutely terrible. On top of all this, the health minister, Brazil's had 2 health ministers. They were fired by the president, and currently the occupier of the health minister is not someone with any expertise on public health issues. He's a military figure, and the health ministry has actually been populated by military figures. So the public health crisis is completely uncontrolled and is currently being handled by people who have no knowledge of such issues. Over the weekend, there was an attempt, and that attempt is still ongoing, not to publish COVID numbers anymore. So Brazil's numbers, which were severely underreported even before this latest initiative at opacity came about, are now probably going to be even more unreliable if they're published at all, which again poses a huge problem. And on top of all this, the response on the economic front has really been lacking. The response on the economic front has not really been up to the severity of the crisis. Brazil has done very little when you compare the types of responses that have been put in place to those of other countries. Brazil has done relatively little. The economy, which was very weak going into this crisis, is already in recession. It contracted in the first quarter of the year. Labor market indicators are awful. Unemployment's on the rise. Labor participation is falling, so a lot of people are dropping out of the labor force. The country is, as we have seen in other parts of the region and in the US as well, the vulnerable population, and especially certain segments of the population, have been hit especially hard. So the poor, the vulnerable have been hit the hardest by the epidemic and by the economic crisis. So when we look at the unemployment numbers, we see the same sort of situation. And by and large, the country is adrift when it comes to policymaking. There isn't any clear path, and the government doesn't seem to understand how severe the crisis is, both on the public health front as well as on the economic front. So that can have potential impact, even though Brazil is the largest economy in the region, it's fairly closed, but it does have a lot of connections with Argentina and with other countries in the Mercosur area. It also has, a lot of ties with other countries in the region. So potentially, if Brazil does end up having a massive recession in 2020, which is what it's looking like, that will have repercussions for the region as a whole. And thus, everybody's looking very closely at what's happening in Brazil. Not to mention, contagion that can come about, literal contagion from the epidemic that can come about from, an epidemic that's totally out of control in the largest country in the region. So, just to wrap up these initial remarks, all of Latin America is facing major challenges. The recovery, whenever it comes, is going to be slow, protracted. There are lots of political problems and institutional problems in the region, but where all of this becomes way starker and more problematic is in Brazil.
Monica, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. I think most of us have been following the news about Brazil from afar and with a sense of alarm. I suppose I feel an even greater sense of alarm as a result of your remarks. So we will come back to some of these questions. Let us now move on to Raj. Raj, would you please share some of your thoughts about remote work with us?
Absolutely. So thanks once again for this opportunity to talk about my research. As Ravi mentioned, I study the geography of work, and the thing that I'm most excited about, and I've been excited about even prior to this pandemic, has been this phenomena of working from anywhere. So I'm going to bring some insights from that research of mine, and I'll talk about what studies I'm doing in the context of India, which is the country I know relatively better. So I'm going to talk about both my research on knowledge workers, which is arguably the right tail of the distribution in the labor market, but then I'll also share some insights about a recent and ongoing study on the left tail of the distribution, which talks about migrant workers in India. So the study I'm in the middle of is to work with TCS, which is India's largest IT giant, and they have more than 450,000 employees worldwide. And they have traditionally been a company just like Facebook or Google, building nice fancy campuses in Indian cities. And just post the pandemic, they made a decision to go 75% remote within 3 years. So this is a huge tectonic shift. And we've heard similar proclamations from Facebook and Twitter. So I'm in the middle of this, so we don't have any results to share. But I'll tell you the thinking that's going behind this. So they're really thinking about the shock as an opportunity to think about where to hire talent from and where to place the talent. And they, of course, have lots of challenges with respect to the immigration system, which is tightening in the US. And so work from anywhere now would enable them to mitigate some of these concerns. But moving a company that's been physical predominantly and taking 300,000 employees to an all remote or majority remote model is surely going to lead to a lot of challenges. But in my early discussions, the thing that I'm most excited about is whether this change will lead to productivity gains. And so what I'm going to show you next is some evidence from one study I've done with the US Patent Office, which has been working from anywhere for 7 years now. But more broadly, this phenomenon of working from anywhere where the worker can choose where to live, and there's no compulsion to come to a physical office ever, is being practiced in the fringe by lots of really cool startups, such as GitLab, and GitLab is not really a startup anymore, but Akamai and Zapier, which is a 500-person organization. But even large companies such as Dell are moving into a majority remote model. So what I did is I did a very deep empirical study at the US Patent Office. And let me just say first thing first, that work from anywhere is fundamentally different from working at home. So in working at home, you're working 3 or 4 days at home under normal circumstances, but you're still visiting a physical office once or twice a month or a week. In working from anywhere, which is what the US Patent Office did starting 2012, you are not constrained by location any longer. And you can go and live in California or Nevada or Florida or wherever you want to, with no requirement to come back to the US Patent Office, which is physically located in Alexandria. So that is what I call geographic flexibility, the choice to live anywhere. And so what we did in this setting is we looked at the productivity outcomes. And of course, we have to carefully tease out correlational outcomes from causality. And I'll skip the details, but there's a union of patent examiners called POPA. And the way they negotiated the rolling out of working from anywhere was based on some quotas for the first 2 years. And we exploit those quotas to come up with causal estimates of productivity gains. And what we found was a striking productivity gain, which didn't mitigate, which didn't come down after the examiner moved from the work from home program to work from anywhere. So that's the transition we're observing. And on aggregate, it was about a 4.4% increase in productivity. And that is, I think, what is also driving how TCS and all these large Indian companies are thinking about work from anywhere. So since I have only 5 or 7 minutes, let me quickly move to the left tail of the distribution and talk about migrant labor. Now, this labor also wants to work from anywhere. And in India, the historical research has shown that the percentage of workers who cross state borders and work in a different state is even lower compared to Brazil and China. So it's much lower than the developed countries, but only 3% of labor actually crosses state borders. And there are lots of frictions for why that happens. But one of the frictions relates to food security. And so what this study looks at is the issue of food security during COVID-19 and how it affects migrant workers who have been suffering, not only in India, but worldwide. And so the specific study that we focus on looks at this policy where migrant workers can now get subsidized food, not in their home state only, but also where they live, wherever they live in India. And so the way you get subsidized food in India is through this process called the ration card, which has been traditionally a physical document and enables you to get subsidized food only in your hometown. But what happened in the last 2 or 2.5 years is India has moved to an electronic ration card, where using biometrics, you can get subsidized food even in your host state, not only in your home state. So this was being implemented piecemeal. So what we did in this study is we collected actual movement data, the human movement data around the lockdown in India from Facebook. So Facebook shared that data with us. And we looked at differences in movement for Indian states which had implemented this portable ration card versus states that had not. And so what we find is there was a striking effect of movement reduction, which is what you want in a lockdown, if the state had implemented ration card portability within the state. So the only effect we found was within the state. So within a state, if you moved from one district to a different district, and that state enabled you to get food in that second district, subsidized food, then you were less likely to move. So we use this difference in differences framework. We use a lot of we use matching techniques, and this result really holds up. And then we see those differences across states which had done greater implementation versus partial implementation and no implementation. So just to wrap up, I guess I'll come back to my theme of work from anywhere and why this is a great opportunity, but also has frictions. And these frictions need to be dealt at both the right tail of the distribution, but also the left tail. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Raj, thank you so much. And I'd like to propose that we come back to this question. Monica mentioned the effects on the poor, and you mentioned this these tales of the distribution in which the effects of quarantine and social distancing are manifesting themselves very differently from, let's say, knowledge workers. And so this possibility that the pandemic and quarantine has been a kind of magnifying glass for some of the already existing inequalities is really a theme that seems worth our attention, both at the country level and in terms of the global distribution of people who can and cannot continue to earn income while they work remotely or from home or anywhere. So this is a really important and interesting question. With that, though, just sort of a hint at a theme to which I'd like to return. Let me ask Willie to share some of his reflections on the global supply chain question.
Sure. Thank you, Rawi, for the invitation. Thank you all. Well, we're really at an interesting time right now. COVID-19 has exposed the interdependencies in the world economy. First, we had this supply shock coming out of China, which really took the form of an extended Lunar New Year period that in some instances extended much longer than people predicted. And that had a time lag before it hit the rest of the world just because of normal transit delays for shipping. But that supply shock then met a demand shock as the rest of the world, not only the viral contagion, which spread around the world, but then the economic contagion, which was quickly transmitted as well. So just as China started coming back on stream, then we had a complete collapse of demand. And in many respects, this is not like anything anybody has ever seen. It's really going on into the third quarter right now. It's exposed a number of things and caused some surprises. Some of us weren't surprised, but a lot of people were surprised. One of them was the global dependency on China for a lot of critical things like personal protective equipment, active pharmaceutical ingredients. A lot of us knew that China was a primary API source, and they went to India, and then India was the primary manufacturer of generic pharmaceuticals worldwide. It also exposed the deep tiering of supply chains, and this is because in this complex technology world that we have today, you have a lot of specialists who make specialized components. So what you have is you have suppliers who supply suppliers who supply suppliers, multiple tiers of the supply chain. Most companies don't have visibility beyond the second or maybe third tier. And that surprised a lot of people. There was also something which hasn't been written a lot about, but I think has been a major shock, which was the critical assumption around predictable logistics. In other words, around container shipping, around air cargo, the fact that I will deliver it to a port in China and it will show up in Antwerp in 32 days, or it'll show up in Long Beach in 17 days, or that I can get air cargo. Okay, when passenger flights around the world got shut down, 60% of air cargo worldwide is carried in the bellies of passenger planes. So we created this enormous shortage of air cargo just at a time when we needed a lot of personal protective equipment. Air cargo rates have hit historic highs. $19 a kilo, Shanghai to Europe, as against 6-7 times the normal. So this, among everything else, has exposed the downside to this kind of lean global supply chain strategies that many firms and countries have depended on. Now, at the same time, this has led to a surge in economic nationalism, right? Which is the quote unquote need to be self-sufficient in critical commodities, which has been exacerbated by temporary export restrictions imposed by China, India, the US, European countries for whatever reason. Okay, but every time somebody sees a temporary export restriction, then they assume the worst. Most people haven't disentangled the demand surge from the supply dependencies. I've talked to lots of people in Washington. A few in the government in Washington really understand how supply chains are structured. So nonetheless, there's now a serious focus in the US on reshoring. So then the question, of course, is what's the result for China, right? I would say it's the acceleration of a trend that was started by the trade war. Many companies and countries are talking about diversification of their supply chains to a China plus one strategy. Actually, before the pandemic, China plus one was already on a lot of people's minds. Now, some people are saying it's got to be more than China plus one. It might be China plus two or plus three or so on. Some US companies, but also some Chinese companies see this in some respects kind of a natural continuation of a trend. I took a class, we visited a lot of Chinese companies back in January before all of this broke out. One of them talked about this flock of geese model where production migrated from first, the West, Europe and US in particular to Japan, and then Korea, Taiwan, Asian tigers, and then ultimately to Japan, right? And so you see Chinese companies now as well thinking about emerging markets, not only Vietnam, but Indonesia, even places like Egypt. On the ground, Chinese manufacturing has recovered pretty quickly. The real question now is what will be the result of the demand shortfalls, okay? And we already can see this in the high level of blank sailings. That means canceled sailings for container ships, which are going into the third quarter. It's kind of foreshadowing a very weak back to school season. Air cargo rates are still high, but they're starting to come down as kind of a lot of the PPE and medical equipment, the emergency supplies catch up, and that's shifting towards ocean. So we're going to see continued supply chain restarts. And as longer term, it's going to depend on what global demand looks like. So a lot of what happens next, I think, is going to depend on whether there's a major second wave of infection, the leading indicators in terms of blank sailings, back to school order season. It's looking like the largest year-over-year decline in global trade that we've seen in my lifetime anyways, okay, percentage-wise. Realistically, what will be the long-term impact on China? Short-term, we're going to see this huge demand drop with an impact on employment, factory utilization. Longer-term, I think China's very fast recovery makes it still very attractive compared to alternatives. It has superior infrastructure, very capable workforce. I think it's going to be very hard. I think it's going to be a mistake for companies to cut China out of their supply chains. But right now, so much of it depends on politics. I see both the US and China not playing this well. I would hope for de-escalation every day. I wake up and read the news and I see another escalation. So it's kind of a crazy time.
Crazy time indeed. Thanks, Willie. One question I'd like for you to contemplate as we hear from Natalia. One of the listeners chatted in a question, and I might make it a bit broader. You mentioned the possibility that it could turn out to be a mistake in some ways to try to cut China out of global supply chains. And if we think about the reason why we had global supply chains as lean and as optimized as they were, is that they were efficient. They delivered lower costs to consumers. And so I wonder if you could just reflect a bit wildly and maybe more uncomfortably than you would prefer on what a long-term settling of this might be. Like, could we imagine a scenario in which it's China plus one, plus two, plus three for a while, then both firms and consumers reimagine the consequences of that, which is that stuff costs more. That's the result of having less lean, optimized supply chains. So could you imagine a sort of push away and then pull back, or could we really believe that this will lead to a more sustained foundational change in how globalization functions? So that's speculative, but we'll come back to that question. So now I'd like to ask Natalia Volchkova to share some of her thoughts, and I believe she also has a presentation she's going to share with us.
Yes, please. Thank you, colleagues, and for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And I will present a bit of data and policy monitoring that we perform with my colleagues from few think tanks in Eastern Europe. We were called ourselves Free Network, which is Forum for Research in Eastern Europe. So we collect the information in the countries that our think tanks are located. And this is Stockholm Institute of Transition Economy in Sweden, my Center for Economic and Financial Research at New Economic School in Moscow, and our colleagues from Belarus, from Kiev, from Tbilisi, from Szczecin in Poland, and from Latvia, Riga. So we worked for many years on some collaborative research, and now we decided to put some efforts in collecting information and data on our countries, how they respond to the both health and economic crisis, because this comparative analysis afterwards would be very important to address the issue of which policies are most suitable for this kind of pandemic. So, just few data that show the very different situation in the countries in the region, in the countries in our network. So in terms of number of cases per million people, how the evolution went through 3 months from March to May. So we have countries with very different number of confirmed cases and deaths. So, and it's surprising that 30 years after Soviet Union, Soviet bloc dissolution, so we have the countries in this our network actually split it in very in the way predetermined by maybe situation 30 years ago. It's of course probably because we have only one country with not Soviet past. It's Sweden, but in this network, but still it is really surprising to see this. So, and of course we look at the situation before the crisis, which is, and important is of course the state of public health system. Despite the fact that there is definitely more possibilities for Sweden to invest in healthcare, it seems that the importance for this particular crisis, for this particular health situation, it was not about the state of high-tech health support, but it's more about routine support, which is more available in other countries, Poland, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia. And this is, you see, that is very easily can be seen by the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. So despite the fact that Sweden invests much more in health system, it does not observe in the number of beds in the hospitals, which is important for particular health situation that the world is coming through. So in terms of Russia, the health policies were heavily oriented on the testing. So Russia performed more than 13 million tests for COVID. So this is 87 tests per 1,000 people. And starting from over last 2-3 weeks now, Moscow started mass testing on antibodies. So this is the way how Russia deals with the situation. So there is problems with how Russia counts, how Russia counts for cases and deaths, and we see a lot of heterogeneity across regions. So it is more region-specific reaction and deal with the numbers. So in terms of money that's spent on this emergency situation, most of money went for the treatment and creation of the new beds to treat sick people. So the Russia did introduce sort of lockdown. It looked probably quite tough, but if we look on numbers that we collect from surveys, actually more than 30% of people continued their work as usual. and around 34% of working people, they switch to distant working, that is schools, universities, and others, and firms that has this opportunity. So in terms of economic policies and about economic responses, it is very important for that in Russia, besides the economic crisis due to epidemic happened, but it's also simultaneously with this, the oil price substantial drop, even negative numbers for a few days on oil price. That was also an important important features that government took into account when deciding on the package of economic support. Another important restrictions on the way the government's economic support was designed, it was the existing technologies, how to channel money and support to people and firms. And actually what Russia found out, it does not exist. It's not surprisingly that most of the economic support package went to families with children. And this was because of pre-existing connection between state, public bodies and families with children because of maternity capital. That was the system that introduced over 15 years in Russia. So it was very easy to reach families with children. This is why most of real support went to these families, because that was very easy to distribute money to these families. For others, for these other vulnerable groups of people, except pensioners, but pensioners sort of is not the poorest group of people in Russia. So, but still some support was also moved there. So while there is definitely a lot of discussions and critique of Russian government because of its sort of inefficient support of the business, as far as the population support concerned, it's definitely was not very bad reaction, and given the limitations of the system. So I will. So Russia is now opening economy quite fast. So there is political reason for this. This constitutional vote that will happen on July 1st, and there is opinion that it's too early to start. Moscow is doing much better than the regions, and the regions, the situation is just worsening still. But this political consideration lead to the very fast opening. In 2 weeks. Moscow will be open up almost completely for all businesses. So that's situation here, and trade in Russia dropped by 14% over in the beginning of the year. Oil price recovered, and in that regard, its budget, public finance are much better shape. So, and given that, the expected fall of GDP this year is around 5%. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Natalia. One question that comes to mind, maybe we'll return to this after we bring in some of the questions from our listeners. You mentioned the way in which the Russian fiscal response seems to have reproduced existing patterns of the relationship between the state and the economy and society. And it strikes me that that has been true across countries as well. It's a really interesting, I think, phenomenon. So the German fiscal response reflects some underlying German patterns of relationships between governments and firms and society. The American reproduces American patterns, the Russian reproduces Russian patterns. And so I'd like to ask you to come back to that question in a few minutes with some reflections about what that might mean for recovery across nations. But before we do that, let me ask Monica and Raj to reflect on one big issue, but manifesting itself in different ways in these two countries. I'll ask Raj to start and then come to Monica, which is this question of the poor, about existing patterns of inequality, about the ability to work remotely and continue to earn income, being unevenly distributed across society, being actually really highly correlated with education levels and with income levels. So the sense that this is like a magnifying glass for things and challenges that already existed. And so I'd like to ask you to reflect on that, both in terms of your work on the geography of work, but also on specific countries in Latin America. And then Monica, when we come to you after Raj shares his thoughts on that, in addition to that question, I wonder if you might share any good news from the region. Some countries, perhaps like Costa Rica, from what I can tell from the news, that have done a better job than the world average, and what the region might learn from those countries, and what indeed the rest of the world might learn from those countries as well. But let's start with Raj on this question of the patterns of income earning capabilities.
Sure. No, thank you, Ravi. I think it's a great question and something I think about all the time. So at least in my work, I think the insights that I'm trying to sort of crystallize is, as you say, this COVID-19 shock has really shown and focused how there is an extremely strong difference between certain workers in their ability to be participative in the economy remotely versus for others where that's not a possibility. So it's not only the right and the left tails of the distribution, it's also there are huge industry differences. So if I'm in the airline industry, or if I'm manufacturing, like Willy's research is showing, I cannot work remotely, presumably, as easily as if I was in the internet industry or I was a software programmer. The other thing I think about is that, so given my research interest and my vantage point, this ability to move between places and the geographic mobility that people want to sort of presumably engage in, there are frictions, I would say, on both the left and the right tail. So for the right tail, the frictions really emanate now from the travel bans and what's happening with tightening immigration. So the president temporarily banned all immigration in the middle of the pandemic, and our students are suffering because of that, because they are on F1 visas and optional practical training programs. And if they cannot get a quick H1B quickly, then that's going to be a really constraint for staying back in the US. But there's also a constraint on the left tail, these migrant labor, where the issue is much more fundamental, and it's one about food. That, if I'm living far away from my hometown in India and I don't have ration card portability, I don't have access to food. So it's a much more foundational concern or a friction they experience. The last thing I'll say, though, and that's why I'm so excited about work from anywhere, because if indeed large companies such as Twitter and Facebook and TCS go with that model of working from anywhere and go with 75% remote or 100% remote companies, then presumably a lot of knowledge workers will return. There'll be a reverse brain drain to their countries or smaller towns. So I'm working with Tulsa Remote, which is an organization in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where individual workers are migrating from the coasts, from Silicon Valley, from New York, to come and live in Tulsa, Oklahoma and work remotely. And if that becomes a phenomena, then even the left tail can go back. So the construction worker doesn't have to leave for Mumbai, because there'll be presumably more construction in the smaller towns. So I feel work from anywhere could be a foundational change in how people think about mobility and could affect both the left and the right. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Raj. That's really interesting. I had not at all imagined that particular implication of sort of the potential to revitalize the hinterland in a variety of economies and have less concentration of income earning capabilities and wealth in major metropolitan areas. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Now, Monica, would you share a few reflections on this question of inequality and the poor and the consequences of both the virus itself, which disproportionately affects the poor who have more underlying health conditions, but then the implications of quarantine? One other question, so if you could also reflect on Costa Rica briefly. A question came in about Cuba and whether its much vaunted healthcare system has managed to weather this particular pandemic crisis.
Okay, so let me start with Cuba, because that's actually the easiest, and it's a good example to talk about the rest. Cuba, in spite of all the troubles that the country's been in over the past several decades, Cuba has been an example in terms of its health system and in terms of the resources that they have. And it's not by chance that Cuban doctors have been going to several places in Latin America to help with, not just COVID, but they were in the region way before that in helping to fill the gaps in certain countries where health resources are very unevenly spread. In fact, the Brazilian government in 2013 instituted a program to bring in Cuban doctors in order to fill a lot of gaps in the northeastern part of the country and in the northern part of the country. So Cuba's responses to the public health crisis reflect this wealth that they have in terms of health capabilities and in terms of personnel, in terms of doctors and health professionals that they have been supplying to the region over the past several years. So it's really striking, and it's something that not many people outside of Latin America know of very well. So that's one very positive thing, and they continue to play that role and have continued to play that role. On inequality and the vulnerable and other issues, Latin America, as we all know, is an extremely unequal region. So levels of inequality, even though there have been social programs across a variety of countries trying to address poverty and inequality and all of that with varying degrees of success, it still remains as a region, it still remains a highly unequal region, where you actually find the highest levels of labor force informality and economic vulnerability among people. So if we look at the data from the ILO, for example, the average, when you look at labor market informality, the average that the ILO estimates of percentage of workers in the informal labor force, it's 50%, 50, in Latin America as a whole. This is heterogeneously distributed. So you have countries like Chile where labor market informality can be as low as 30, but then you have countries like Ecuador and Peru where labor market informality hovers around 70 to 80%. These are precise. In Brazil, it's around 50 to 60% because the amount has actually risen quite substantially. In Mexico, it's 60%. So we're talking here about a group of people who, in view of the pandemic, the health concerns, the public health measures that have to be put in place, are people who are displaced from job markets. They can't circulate. The types of activities that they do involve sort of hand-to-mouth daily activities where that's where they earn their income to put food on the table. And this has presented a major challenge across the region in terms of how do you respond to the public health crisis and to the economic problems that result from it. It is not by chance that we're seeing across the region in many different countries attempts at trying to think about basic income programs. So Ecuador has adopted an emergency basic income program, even though, as I said before, they've been facing a lot of challenges. Chile is now proposing to do the same, a focused program for informal workers and for the poor. Brazil has an emergency basic income program in effect right now, which covers tens of millions of people, actually, and is now due to be extended. There's a raging discussion in Brazil at the moment on a permanent basic income program. So basic income, the idea of basic income has really gained a lot of traction in view of the pandemic because it exposes, these informal workers who are extremely vulnerable and who are the most impacted by not just the disease itself, but also, the economic fallout from the disease. On the disease itself, it is also notable that when you look across Latin American countries and Latin American urban centers, and especially the periphery, we know that it is a region marked by severe or very significant agglomeration of people in slums, in favelas, in the periphery of these urban centers. And that is also one of the reasons why this population has been disproportionately affected, because evidently it is very, very hard to institute social distancing measures in a favela. Having said that, though, what has been interesting to see across the region as a whole, but I've been following the experiences in Brazil more closely, is that in a lot of these communities, in a lot of these places where, favelas and slums and that, where, there hasn't really been a public presence, a public authority presence, the favelas and the slums themselves and these communities have self-organized to ensure that people are protected. So even though they're suffering a lot the effects of the fallout from the crisis, there's a lot of internal organization going on with just community leaders trying to do the best they can in terms of not just helping families, but trying to maintain some semblance of social distancing in these places. So these initiatives have been very interesting, extremely interesting to see take place, and some of them have been pretty successful at least protecting the people who live in these communities. So these are some of the reasons why, when you look across Latin America as a region, you see disproportionately how the vulnerable, the informal workers, people who live in slums and favelas and so on are so affected by the disease. The case of Costa Rica is really interesting. I would just underline the following. Costa Rica, of course, is a very small country, and being small is actually helpful in these situations. So I would actually highlight two cases where the fight against COVID and the economic responses have been sort of examples in the region. And those countries are Costa Rica on the one hand and Uruguay on the other. Uruguay actually jumps out at me more in a way because it is right there, sort of squished between Argentina and Brazil. And it's an economy that's highly dependent on both Argentina and Brazil, but nonetheless, it's been able to weather the economic crisis really well. But more than that, it's been able to weather the public health crisis very well. So it's a country that put in place social distancing, quarantines, and all of that. And mind you, which is really important when you compare even to Costa Rica, it's a country where the demographics were highly unfavorable because Uruguay has one of the oldest populations in the region. And so, looking at risk factors and how the elderly are disproportionately affected by COVID, everybody had this impression that Uruguay was potentially one of the countries that could be the hardest hit. And that has not been the case. It's been actually precisely the opposite. And it has kind of served as a sort of an example to other countries like Costa Rica in Central America. Now, as I was saying before, the thing about these two countries is that they're small. So the scope for action is, it reaches more people. Both countries, Uruguay in a sense more than Costa Rica, but both countries have populations. Yes, they have poor populations, they have informal workers, they have vulnerable people, but by and large, they show a little bit more homogeneity in terms of their structure, in terms of their social economic structure than other countries in Latin America, and that is also helpful. So there are particularities about Costa Rica and Uruguay that can't exactly be replicated across the region, although the fact that these two countries acted very fast and did not at any moment sort of glimpse or question the severity of the disease and of the economic fallout is to be commended, because they really did take early action. They used the window of opportunity that was available to the whole region, because it took a while for the epidemic to reach Latin America. So they prepared themselves and they prepared the measures to put in place, and therefore they've been able to fare the best. So I think the one lesson that one can draw from Latin America is that, countries that were better prepared have fared a lot better than others, and countries who continue to be very ill prepared or are not really doing anything are the countries who are not only going to suffer the most, but the ones who are going to have the most protracted, slow recoveries and potentially the biggest impact on their vulnerable populations.
Thank you so much, Monica, for those reflections. And I want to ask Willie and Natalia a couple of questions. And if we have time, and if you're able to stay with us, I'd like to come back to you for some thoughts about the efforts of governments to manage the story that they're trying to tell, both to their domestic societies and to the world, about their achievements and disappointments, and the relative effectiveness or ineffectiveness of those attempts to manage and to really tell the story. Okay, so we will not be able to come back to Monica because she has another commitment. So thank you again for joining us. Let me move on to Will.
Thank you.
So Willie, can we ask you to be a bit speculative about the semi-permanent nature of some of these changes in global supply chains, and or at least scenarios for how they might emerge, whether we sort of pull away from China a little bit and then have the economic logic pull us back, or whether we could imagine a sort of more stable reconfiguration. And a couple of other questions that have come in, just to throw them out briefly, if you have anything you'd like to share with us about them. One is this trend toward redefining product categories as essential to national security, as a sort of policy change that might reshape global supply chains, whether or not firms reconsider the economics of those supply chains. So whether that is PPE, which is plausibly a national security question if one is in the middle of a pandemic, or automobiles, which is a little bit less plausibly, but this sort of appetite for redefining product categories. And then one last little thing, if I could, the China +1, +2, +3, are there opportunities here for countries to be the new +2 or the new +3, as the firms themselves are imagining a kind of disaggregation of supply chains, opportunities that countries might not have had when they were really so lean? So a lot to reflect on, but there's a lot of appetite as well for you to share some of your wisdom on these questions.
Well, Rawi, I think a lot of complex forces. I'll start out with, I'm a little skeptical about the durability of, I want to pull everything back and I want to go to a national. I'd be a little more supportive of regional production rather than national. Regional, I would think about America as a region, or I've told people, the U.S. and Western, or actually all of Europe, could think of themselves as a region. Okay, but the reason I'm skeptical is, especially with the economic impact on people everywhere, nobody is going to be willing to pay higher prices. Okay, and when you talk about, for example, bringing production back into the U.S., we have a labor rate that is, 7x China. Okay, and you say, well, we'll make it up on productivity, or we'll use automation and stuff like that. The thing that makes China such a manufacturing powerhouse, there's a couple of things. First, over the last 2 decades, they have invested to capture the supplier networks that support their manufacturing infrastructure. Okay, in other countries, the US, Europe, Japan has resisted it more. Korea has resisted it more, but China has done a very good job capturing supply chains. Number 2, a workforce that is flexible, that you can mobilize. When Apple wants to launch a new iPhone, and they talk to Honghai, or Foxconn as it's more generally known, it's like, okay, well, I need 10 million iPhones for a launch. Where else in the world can I recruit 500,000 workers, to come and work overtime? And that type of labor, the ability to mobilize labor, and the flexibility. Okay, and then the other thing is they have very efficient logistics and port infrastructure that they poured a lot of money into. So when you go to China +1 or China +2, let's say you go to Vietnam, which is a popular destination, or Indonesia, or somewhere like that, a lot of people haven't figured out that a lot of these locations, for example, don't have the port infrastructure. They don't have direct liner service. They can't handle, right now on the east-west and China trade, like from China to the U.S. West Coast, or China to Europe particularly, they're putting 24,000 TEU container ships on, which are the largest. Vietnam ports can't handle anything like that, right? So a lot of people are saying, Okay, I don't have the infrastructure for that. Number two, I don't have the direct links. So if I'm going to ship from Vietnam or ship from Indonesia, then I'm going to be transshipping in Singapore or transshipping in Hong Kong, right? So all of those things add cost, they add time to the supply chain. So I'm a little skeptical that, countries have the horizon outside of an election horizon to really focus on that. You see a lot of this attention, to the point of I'm going to declare all these things critical to national security. What that reflects is just a lack of understanding of how the world actually works in terms of how all these components and how much interdependency we've built up over the years. So, there is no end to the list that you can find anything that is potentially, have its links traced back to China. Now, the answer to a lot of these supply insecurity questions is to have stockpiles or have bigger inventories and things, which is something that, I have to admit, we've trained MBAs, we've trained managers at the Harvard Business School. It's like, get rid of all that inventory. All the MBAs coming out of here, it's like they hate inventory, right? Because there's risk of obsolescence, there's carrying costs and all those things. Now we've seen the weakness of all those things. In terms of the other opportunities, I do think there are other opportunities. The Chinese firms are looking to South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, places like Egypt, Ethiopia, and things like that. When we took our class in January to look at some of these Belt and Road projects, we took them to Sri Lanka, okay, and we took them to Myanmar. Those are two, if you really want to feel an emerging market, you should go to Myanmar, okay? And in fact, a lot of the entrepreneurs there are from China who say, I missed it when China opened up in the late 90s and early 2000s. Okay, and I'm here for the next opportunity. So I do think there are those opportunities out there. But, going back to the bigger question, I'm a little skeptical that a lot of this is going to change. You'll see it in strategic products like ventilators and PPE for sure. Okay, because there the government is willing to pour money into it, and most governments will be willing to pour into it because they've learned the lesson from this shortage. More broadly, it's hard work.
Thanks so much, Willie. Natalia, can we ask you to share a couple of reflections about two things? So one is this fascinating story that you told about how pre-existing relationships, fiscal relationships between the Russian government and Russian society were reproduced and magnified by the fiscal response to quarantine and pandemic. And that seems to be true across countries generally. And so if you could just maybe reflect a little bit on what that might mean for the shape of the recovery or for the kinds of economic dislocation that might exist across the countries that you know well, perhaps including the group of countries in your consortium. And then another question that came in, perhaps you could reflect on this issue of what the relationship between Russia and China might be like as a result of a range of issues, the tensions in the Russian economy, the closing of the border, but also just the collapse of energy prices as well, since that's a key piece of their relationship.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi, for these questions. And I think that's the first this question is a very important one, and it is at the same time it is very natural. So if when we compare corporate and public sector, we always think about a lot of inertia and low flexibility of the public sector, both state and public companies. That's what makes them less efficient than the private sector. So, and this kind of inertia will not disappear even in the time of very fast developing crisis. This is that means that a state cannot create nothing new in this very short time. So they will use very existing technologies and existing networks to support the economy. That's what is available to them. And it's one story is this fiscal story, and another is the overall approach to deal with crisis. So essentially, the states, given this very specific and very peculiar nature of this particular crisis, which is not like really traditional demand side crisis, it is more supply side shock. So in this situation, the state is all states actually were choosing between supporting vulnerable group of peoples or support firms. So, and if there is no network, safety nets within countries which address the needs of vulnerable group of people, then it's only one way to go to firms. But at the same time, the important dimension here was, if we look, for example, compare European approach and the Russian approach, so in the American one. So it's the way how to support employment and support unemployed people. In Russia, for years, the overall idea, like for last 20 years, a lot of efforts by state were put to preserve employment, even highly inefficient one. That was the overall idea. State was very reluctant. So this any idea of social unrest is very bad thing considered by Russian government. So everything was done. So they paid for firms to keep inefficient employment. So in this, it means that the network of offices, of public offices, which deal with unemployed people, does not exist. So it's very reluctant one. The people who work in these offices are those whose main target was to keep unemployment as low as possible. And in 2 months, both attitude of the state and the existing technologies, how the state can address this, does not exist. This is why the package of Russian aid aimed at business is to give credits, like the last packages, provides loans to firms with at a very low interest rate, and even with further amendment that these loans will be forgiven in a year if the firms preserve more than 90% of employment. So the state put incentives for firms to keep employment, even an efficient one. But that's how it is, because that is for 20 years the state was doing this, and it did not change. So this is this attitude actually shaped this in the existing technologies for state population relations. It's actually even emphasized in this crisis. So this is why I think if we look at the experience of all countries, we will see this, and both attitudes and existing networks. This is why it is very important when we talk about digitalization of the public sphere, to keep in mind that in times of crisis, we need networks which can reach vulnerable group of people. So countries should think, and I think it's an important lesson from this crisis that the states should think about, and we definitely will do this in Russia. So this both communication, actually this communication, given this our distant work and distant learning and everything, so communication between state and population, it's very important. And actually Moscow did really well in that regard. It's maybe not very honest and fair, but the use of technologies was actually very admirable. So in terms of Chinese-Russian relation, I think that it's one of the important issues given the trade wars that still over, and definitely China is one of the most most important trade partner given the sanctions and overall situation in the world and WTO. So there is definitely energy. Trade with China for Russia is the essential one. So I think that's the development at the international trade policy sphere emphasize this relation even more. I mean, this Russia-China trade, and I think it will be developing and increasing over next future. So there's no other way around, because sanctions that actually prevent development of Russian integration projects to the West.
Thank you so much, Natalia. So I would like to pose one more question to each of you, and maybe ask you to take about 90 seconds to share a reflection on that question. And we'll start with Raj and then Willie and then end with Natalia. And the question is how you see the differential effect on kinds of industries of some of these transformations, both within countries and perhaps at a more global scale. And so Raj, you talked about the productivity gains. How variable are they across kinds of industries? And what are the sorts of influences on whether working from anywhere gives you a big boost or a small boost in productivity? And what has your research suggested about that? And then for Willie, the industries that might seem poised to benefit or reemerge more robustly as we make our way into a recovery, partly as a result of this mix of policies, including quarantine and relabeling products and adding some slack into global supply chains. And then Natalia, perhaps just a quick reflection on industries in Russia or some other countries in your consortium that seem like when the recovery comes, they'll be able to emerge quickly and strongly. So let's just take 90 seconds for each of you with a few quick reflections on that question.
Sure. So I'll go first, Ravi. So once again, great question. And I'll preface by saying that most of my research is actually with knowledge workers in tech settings. That's the thing I know better. But within that, I would say there would be heterogeneity in how work from anywhere might affect productivity. And so I guess this will be really helpful for companies which want to save real estate, are located in extremely expensive locations, are affected by immigration woes, and need to get a lot of people moving across geographies, just given how immigration is tightening. And I would say whether a company is successful or not in getting productivity gains is also contingent upon how they transform the organizational processes of how workers communicate across time zones, how people are socialized in an online, virtual, remote setting, so that no one is falling through the cracks, how information is shared. So I feel a lot of organizational processes need to be updated and transformed to make all remote and work from anywhere work.
Thanks, Raj. Willie.
Okay, yeah, so you talked about sectors. I might slice it a little differently. Okay, one of the things the crisis has done is it's caused a lot of people to make dramatic shifts in how they do things, responding to shifts in demand, shifts in supply. Those that for whom the crisis unlocked some of their organizational processes and gave them a new level of flexibility, I think are going to do well. Okay, a lot who did not, who tried to kind of take a bunker mentality and try to wait this thing out, I think is going to be an accelerated winnowing of those. There will be some sectors like tech sector, especially communications gear, computing, things like that will do very well. You know, I think the pharma industry has a chance to reshape public opinion about them, depending on how vaccines and therapies play out. But it's going to be very mixed.
Thanks, Willie. Natalia.
I believe that the development of last few months, it's actually emphasized this discussion that we had for a few years already within G20 and other platforms of future of works. This crisis emphasized the maybe accelerate this movement toward future, and definitely jobs that are more flexible and allow this distance to be implemented. It definitely will be the one that will succeed and rise productivity very fast. And there will be more investment in the infrastructure which is necessary for this sort of change. But definitely the traditional sector will still be in place. We'll still need now, and we saw how the demand for emergency medical goods increased dramatically in countries without pre-existing networks, and supply were definitely in danger. So I think there will be these two tendencies. In private sector, there will be more movement toward digitalization and implementation of this flexibility, which is actually a very important part of resilience. It's not just robustness, it's resilience which matters now, how we will go out of this crisis. And for this is flexibility semester. But at the same time, the states will, and we do observe this tendency, look for more sovereignty, which is very unfortunate for international trade. This sovereignty which ensures that masks and ventilators are available for the countries in state of emergency. But I hope this will not be the attitudes for a long period. It will be short-term because productivity and efficiency matters a lot.
Thank you. Well, I'll share one last reflection on what I think I've learned from our colleagues who were kind enough to share their time and insight with us, which is that in a way, every existing geopolitical or business or social trend before the pandemic was accelerated, its effects magnified, and there are some patterns that have reproduced themselves. And then in each of those accelerated trends or magnified issues, there's at least one, if not several, surprising twists about how it actually happened and how it actually played out. So this has been a fascinating and enlightening discussion. So I'd like to thank you, Raj and Willie and Natalia, and as well Monica, who had to leave us a little bit early, for joining us. Thank you all for listening in on this conversation. I hope that it will be just the first of many collaborations within Harvard to bring together experts who do not normally get a chance to share the same room or even the same screen, to actually do that a little bit more. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, dear colleagues, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom, and all of you stay safe and well.